Hi, this is Paul. It wasn't too long ago that I heard the announcement that N.T. Wright, or Tom Wright, he's often called N.T. Wright in the United States, he's called Tom Wright in the UK, former Bishop of Durham. He's probably retired now. If you think I put out a lot of videos, this guy puts out books like I put out videos. If Once you become aware of N.T. Wright and once you start reading his books, this guy seems to write books faster than newspapers can print newspaper, and the pace of his production of books is absolutely astounding. Now, he's one of the most prominent New Testament scholars in the world today. I'd say he's a crunchy Christian in that he believes in things like the physicality of the resurrection, in terms of his on a culture, on a church, progressive, conservative spectrum. He'd be a moderate in that he is in favor of women's ordination in the Anglican Church. He is not in favor of changing the Christian standard with respect to human sexuality. I first started bumping into Tom Wright's books years ago, and early days before smartphones, I would find MP3 recordings of his lectures, and I would listen to them. I should make mention of one book because it's come up in some conversations. So, in a previous recording of this, I said Tom Holland. Tom Wright has sort of three levels of books. One level are his academic books, where he's mostly engaging with scholars and ministers, let's say. And his magnum opus, The New Testament and the People of God. Then there's a book, Jesus and the Victory of God, The Resurrection of the Son of God, and then another massive 2-volume fourth part of this series on the Apostle Paul. He has a fair number of, I'd say, middle-brow books like these. This is one of my favorites, Surprised by Hope, deals with eschatology. The subtitle is Rethinking Heaven and the Resurrection and the Mission of the Church. And then he has a series of very basic commentaries that people can use to read along with the New Testament to try to make sense of the passages. The Bishop of Durham position is a position where a scholar tries to do work that's at the lay level. And so Tom Wright has books at all of those three levels. And as I said before, he writes an astounding number of books. He's incredibly prolific in what he does. Douglas Murray, for some of you, needs less introduction. Douglas Murray is an editor at I think it's the Statesman. It's a UK thing. He's a very interesting guy because he is a gay conservative, very conservative politically, and that comes through. Justin Brierley will ask him all the Justin Brierley, you. I just crack up when Justin just gets all in their business. We'll let Justin get into it but Douglas Murray, he was the last two Peterson Sam Harris debates. Douglas Murray was the moderator. I really enjoy. Douglas Murray has just such a sharp wit, but his position with respect to Christianity is also sort of there in that Peterson, Tom Holland space, each sort of in their own way. So let's get into the conversation
today. I think this is the first time we've had you both together for a conversation, though I'm sure you're both aware of each other a little. Douglas, have you bumped into Tom's work before coming on the show tonight?
I certainly have, and read parts of it over the years, and actually have recently been reading at the recommendation of many people his excellent biography of Paul, which I've been immersed in. And so yes.
So I don't have a physical copy. I have a Kindle copy and an Audible copy, and I buy sometimes with some of these books. I wind up buying 3 or 4 copies, which gets a little insane because I want it on Kindle and I want it on Audible. And that biography of Paul is also a terrific book by Tom Wright. And if you like history and like sort of the intersection of Christianity and history, Tom Wright is a very prolific author.
Very much so. And,
fantastic. And Tom, you actually have both sort of had a little bit of a to and fro in the pages of The Spectator, actually, in as much as I know that you recently responded to an article by Douglas, didn't you?
Yes. I've read Douglas in The Spectator frequently, and I've now read his book, The Madness of Crowds, as well, with great enjoyment and rather scary interest, because it's quite a dystopian.
Oh, okay, so I guess I got it wrong. It's The Spectator. And I also just looked up N.T. Wright is 72 years old.
Vision, but the article in The Spectator did to me what articles sometimes do, which made me pace around the house for half the day thinking, I really have to write something about this, and thinking, no, don't be silly, you haven't got time, don't do it. And eventually the worm in my head turned into rather quick prose. I was thinking of an article, but it turned into a letter, but I hope it was stimulating anyway.
Well,
now we're going to get into that. And so again, Tom Wright is 72 years old. Douglas Murray is 41 years old. There's really a generation between them. And when it gets into the issue that they're going to get into, that generation is important because this has been something that's been coming up again and again lately. We'll get into it when we get into it.
I certainly did find it stimulating, and we'll maybe come to that issue in a moment's time. Sure. But before we get to that, Douglas, how are you? How have you been coping with the past COVID year? How have things been?
Like everyone, it's a bleak time in lots of ways, and has things that are salvageable in it. I've had far more time to read than I normally do. I've very much enjoyed that. I've had the opportunity to do a lot of thinking, a lot of writing. I said at the beginning of the pandemic that in a way, those of us who are writers are rather well set up for it. To be a writer is to be able to deal with solitude, and that indeed you must have solitude. So we're rather practiced at it, but nevertheless, nothing can prepare you for something as strange as the era we've been through. And I suppose, maybe not leap straight in, but I do think that certainly my readings back over history and plagues in history seem to bear out one of the things I feel at the moment, which is that they have a disorientating effect on the civilizations across which they roam. All sorts of strange things come out of the woodwork, strange beliefs, strange fears, things you didn't know were there. And I think that's very much the case in our society and across the world in the last year, as much as it has been in history.
Yeah.
Yes, and as Justin knows, I wrote a little book last year called God and the Pandemic.
I can't write one book. This dude, he trips on a step and a book falls out. I mean, that's the way he does this. And
the publishers put a subtitle, something like The Coronavirus and Its Aftermath, hoping that the pandemic would be over in a month or two, but that the book would still sell. And now it's a bit, well, we're still waiting for the aftermath a year later. Yeah. But that was really in response precisely to what Douglas has just said, that particularly in America, but also in other parts of the world, the sudden arrival of this pandemic and all that it's meant has produced all sorts of apocalyptic speculations. And is this a sign of the end of the world? And or does this mean that God is punishing us for some specific wrongdoing or whatever? And it came as a shock to many people that there have been pandemics and plagues and so on over history reasonably frequently. And it's just that in the last century, we in the West have been protected from major disease like this. So we were kind of unprepared. I see it as like a sort of wartime conditions in that everything is different and we just have to get through it. And when we look back, there will be all sorts of things where we say, oh, what a pity that had to happen, or this came about, or whatever. So I think there's a lot of navigation and negotiation still to be done.
It does present an interesting context within which to be having today's conversation. We're asking, can we find a story to live by in a post-Christian world? And I wonder if we could start with your own story, Douglas. For those who perhaps haven't come across you before or don't know this particular aspect of your life, you did make claim to a faith yourself at one time. So tell us a little bit about that and what happened along the way.
Well, I'm like most people from Britain. I'm not that comfortable about speaking about myself. I know
we Americans, we love it.
live in an era where everyone volunteers up their personal story first. I tend to avoid.
I ask for it first.
To do it last, if at all. Yes, I mean it's not a secret, that having been said. I was born and brought up a Christian, as a believing Christian from I think most of my life, including through my adult life, and I'm now in I suppose a self-confessedly conflicted, complex situation of being, among other things, an uncomfortable agnostic who recognizes the values and the virtues that the Christian faith has brought.
Now, I have to mention Esther O'Reilly, and some of you don't know who she is. She is a blogger, and she actually did a conversation with Douglas Murray and Justin Brierley on Unbelievable. And Esther, if you're curious about a lot of things Douglas Murray, I'll put some links below of some of Esther's work where you can, because she's engaged with him on some of these issues, and she's written quite a bit on Jordan Peterson too, but she's really taken quite an interest in Douglas Murray and his work on this, because he is a gay man. And so how does that intersection work? And we're going to have to talk about that when we hear him get into his scolding of the church. Now, when I listened to this, I thought I was reminded of, again, Jordan Peterson's posture of kind of a scold of the church, which is really quite interesting, because the church sort of gets scolded from all sides lately. The church has a lot of scolding from the left, and when I say the left, the progressive faction, and what we get from Douglas Murray and Jordan Peterson, in some ways, are scoldings from the right, but we'll have to get into this.
I think I sort of laid out how I think our civilization, our culture has got to the stage that it is at the moment, and its current uncomfortable relationship with faith. I tried to lay that out in The Strange Death of Europe. I still...
And The Strange Death of Europe, and I forget, right? Again, I have them all on Kindle and Audible. He's a... You don't want to be this man's enemy if he has a pen in his hand. This guy can really write, and he is fast and he is sharp, and I those books, just when I read them, it's pretty amazing.
I still believe what I wrote there was accurate as a diagnosis of the era. But it's and it's a very uncomfortable, as I say, position that someone like me is in, because I say, there has been a period of rejection of faith, particularly from what in our lifetimes has been known as the New Atheist movement, which made claims that were self-confessedly wrong. That, for instance, actually, I think as a late friend of both Tom Wright's and mine, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs once said, that the claim that, for instance, morality was obvious was obviously wrong. The claim that basic ethics that we might share are self-evident is self-evidently not the case. One doesn't have to be an ethicist to know that. You just need to travel. You just need to read, look and listen, and to know that's the case. So there has, in my view, I think we spoke about this before, Justin, that there has, in my view, been an interesting movement in recent years, which I think Tom Holland, who you mentioned earlier, was certainly...
I mentioned on Twitter that I beamed when he said Tom Holland, because two of the people I want to see talk to one another in front of cameras and on YouTube are him and Tom Holland, because it would be very interesting to listen to them compare notes. Maybe for Justin Brierley's program, they're a little bit too close, but again, I see Douglas Murray, Jordan Peterson, Tom Holland, all sort of in this same space right now. And then Esther mentioned, yeah, but he mentioned Tom Holland before when I was talking to him. It's okay, Esther.
An example of people saying, actually, if we go back and look at this, what we have and what we like does have roots in this, in the Christian story. Now, the follow-on question from there, I suppose, is, well, what do we do about it? And I think that a great failing of our time has been the tendency to talk past each other on this. The religious tend to say, well, it's easy. You just have to believe. If you recognize these virtues and values, then believe. And
again, I knew when this video was coming up, I'd be excited to watch it. And then these passages right here are just golden, because I think Douglas Murray is exactly right here. There's talking past each other, but I think Christians don't understand the challenges of this just believe. And I will post this after my conversation with Sevilla King, and where we get into psychedelics and Jordan Peterson, and that was quite a conversation. But it is easy for me. Now Douglas Murray was raised in the church, and so those pathways, those relational pathways, that relational mechanism was formed in him. But just like Jordan Peterson sort of pauses around this whole belief thing, I think we have to, those of us in the church have to listen very carefully at this point and patiently and to try to figure out how to be helpful. Because what Murray is talking about here, I think I've heard from many, many people. And because we have this, I think part of what happened in the church is that in our individualism, we all thought that belief was sort of what we did ourselves as individuals. And I think we believe in communities. And to go back to a really interesting video between Tony and Bart Campolo, when they both wrote a book together on Bart Campolo's leaving the faith. You know, Tony Campolo basically says to Bart, you stopped going to church. Well, so what? That's just a thing that I do. No. We believe elephants and riders. We believe in herds. We believe what the herd believes. And it's not immediately obvious how faith is kindled in us. Now, in Douglas Murray's case, you know, I'm certain that the ongoing conflict within the church over same-sex marriage and a variety of these issues didn't do anything to help Douglas Murray in this case. But yeah, it would be interesting to explore, but you Brits are a little reticent about the whole thing. So hey, I get that.
Doesn't take into account the fact that very many people, then if you ask each other on this, the religious tend to say, well, it's easy. You just have to believe. If you recognize these virtues and values, then believe. And doesn't take into account the fact that very many people today, it is harder than that for all sorts of reasons we could go into. But I would just make one other observation, which is that even outside of faith, I have an added discomfort, which is the discomfort of a non-believer who is disappointed by the behavior of the believing church. Now, many people
in a particular direction. And, you know, when Justin had Tom Holland on with, I think, Michael Bird, who is, I think, an Australian New Testament scholar. And I believe Michael Bird and N.T. Wright cooperated on yet another book by N.T. Wright, you know, and N.T. Wright, like I said, trips on the sidewalk and a book falls out. Oh, there's a book. I mean, he's just dropping books the way rabbits drop babies. But Tom Holland there expressed many similar things. The pandemic hit, and Tom Holland, who is a historian and so well versed in readings of epidemics and how Christians responded to them and miracles and faith, and he looks at the church today and he's like, "You just sort of a mouthpiece for, in Britain, the NHS. We already have an NHS. What are you for?" And this, when it comes to the critique of the church from Peterson and Murray and Holland, they're looking to the church and saying, "Hey, you've got all this language about, being God's representatives and this creator God who thunders from Sinai and turns water into wine and raises the dead and heals the sick and does all of this. Your performance is underwhelming, quite frankly, and underwhelming in comparison to," I haven't talked about platforms in the last few videos, but in comparison to the NHS. Now, in that video on Unbelievable with Tom Holland and Michael Bird, Tom Holland is very well aware that in many ways modern medicine grows out of science and Christianity's hospitality. In fact, Tom Holland's main point, did I mention his book Dominion? Tom Holland's main point is that all of this stuff grows out of Christianity, and in a sense, part of what the church deals with now are the consequences of our own success. That the church has so dramatically successfully spun off so many different elements of its vision. Well, now the church doesn't quite know what the core of its mission is. And I think that is also deeply tied to the meaning crisis. About 2 months ago, I planned to do a 4-video series. I only got one of them done because the second video was to be mapped onto evangelism. And every time I try to make that video, I run into these issues. And so the church is caught between two groups. On one hand, there's groups that saying the church has to keep up with the times. And on the other hand, the church is like, no, you're a little too much like the times. And so, pastors who can at times be quivering, they either fall on one side of being blowhards who thunder and show relatively little power, or quivering masses of availability. And then, do you need us to tell people to wear masks and stay home? Oh, we'll gladly pass the message for you. Oh, do you need us to do this for you? Either Republicans or Democrats, or however the split is. Do you need us to message our people for you? Well, you know what? They've got television and radio and internet and billions of dollars. And at least in the UK, who's in the church, and in the US, everybody in church might be spending an hour with you and 50 hours with Netflix. So no, they don't need you to carry the message. Oh, we'd like you to use your influence because there's a little sliver of people, at least in the UK, a bigger sliver in the United States, who you have some influence on. So let me reach my hand into that hole in the back so I can get it all the way up to your mouth and move your lips for you. And Holland and Peterson and Murray are saying, I have no respect for such a thing. And they're right. And so they ask, you're supposed to represent the Son of God. At least the Son of Sam was interesting.
People think that that's paradoxical, but it isn't at all. I not only was brought up in, but afterwards sought the church as it has been in England, and its jewels and gems of the King James Bible, the Book of Common Prayer. And
now, if you go back to one of my videos I did recently where Peterson, who was he talking to? It was his question and answer. That was a good video. His question and answer where he's talking about his clients and the types of clients that would tend to gravitate towards which types of care for their religious souls. And so Murray he's a writer, and so he's a deep conservative, and he wants to go to church to hear the church be the church. And again, it's the It's the Roman Catholic churches with the Latin Mass that are going. And I began to see this. Part of the difficulty that we have here, and actually Murray will make this case in a little while, is that the church has a history, and that history is relevant, but very few people are terribly interested in that history, and the church itself isn't a terribly good articulator of its history, because what happened in the 80s and 90s was the seeker movement, and what that meant was the baby boomers had very much pushed away the pre-World War II churches with all of their churchiness. And the seeker movement comes along and says, that scares baby boomers. And so let's take down all the trappings and let's meet in a blank auditorium and let's play jazz music and we'll set them up for, and Bill Hybels, John Ortberg, Rick Warren, these guys were preachers. Let's set them up for an evangelistic message and we'll update it for the modern world and we'll deal with updating this. The church will be relevant. And Douglas Murray, so that was the boomers. And then the Xers, the busters. So I was born in the early 60s, so I'm right at the cusp of the boomers and then the busters. And then the Xers came along and said to the church, if I want to hear popular music, I'll listen to it on the radio or on a CD and eventually an MP3. I'll download it from the internet. Plus, the popular music you do, for the most part, is really bad. So don't bother. And, then we have all these splits going on in churches and all of these. In the 80s and 90s, there's this big worship wars in churches between traditional worship and contemporary worship. And that battle was fought for 20, 25 years and finally blended one in many cases, or contemporary worship, or they just had multiple services in a consumer way to sort, well, do you like traditional music? We have that. Do you like this? We have that. But again, the church is sort of this quivering mass of availability. And one of the things that you'd see that is that tremendously demanding, often conservative, sometimes authoritarian churches would grow because people are saying, I just want someone to follow, and someone would step out of the woodwork like John Brown in the Civil War and be big and full of loud noise and bluster and say, here I am, follow me. And okay. And off they go. And things get weird sometimes, like Westboro Baptist Church. And that's the irony of some of this admonition. It's like the churches are simpering, mouthpieces of either bad pop culture or government orthodoxy. We want a church that looks more like John the Baptist. Well, Westboro Baptist kind of looks, no, not that kind. Okay, but what kind? Because each is sort of pretty selective in their critique. And the same goes for the left and their critique, because, well, we want you to just, we just want you to change in terms of what women are and aren't allowed to do and the whole gay thing. Just change those little bits, but leave everything else the same. No, you don't really want that, do you? Because, in fact, what you sort of want is for, the church to sound like what you want it to sound. And in a consumer culture, we shouldn't be surprised that consumers demand of what they perceive as basically a religious service provider to provide the goods and services that we as religious consumers demand. And they may be demanding it from the conservative end, or they may be demanding it from the progressive end. But, church, dance to the tunes that we like. And churches feeling rather insecure and unsure of their own story, as Douglas Murray will basically say, why don't you be the church? And Tom Holland will say it. And Jordan Peterson will say it. Well, churches have to say basically to everyone, you might not like everything we bring to you. They say, well, yeah, but we don't always like what the church brings to us too. And some of the most important and best things are things that it needs to say. And, again, I'll often make the comment that the Son of God comes to the world and most people can't stand him, and they figure the best way to shut him up is make an example of him by putting him up on a cross. So that the church is unpopular, that shouldn't be a surprise, but unpopular in which way?
Much more, and it's been my experience, as it has been for many other people brought up in recent decades and last century and more, that one has observed the church giving up its jewels and becoming something else. And actually, that irritation I feel from the outside, albeit from the outside at the moment, that irritation I feel about the church hasn't gone away even whilst being outside it. Fear, it comes back to that article that provoked Tom Wright's excellent letter. My fear is constantly the church is not doing what so many of us on the outside would like it to do.
And again, when he says this, generally speaking, the church in America sometimes looks over its right shoulder at the people more conservative. In the UK, looks over its left shoulder. The church doesn't want what the people want it to do. Well, I hear a lot of the deconstructionists saying the church isn't doing what we want it to do. And this actually is the long-standing problem with Jesus. Jesus doesn't frame things the way the disciples expect him to frame. Jesus selects his apostles from across the Judean culture war, which, no, you shouldn't meet with those people. Pharisees don't think he should eat with tax collectors and sinners. You wouldn't have a zealot and a tax collector in your same inner circle, Jesus. And Jesus just basically says, try me. And yeah, we'll try you and then we'll kill you. And again, but I don't want to be dismissive of Douglas Murray here, because his point is the church has lost its saltiness. And I was doing a men's Bible study. Again, we have our men's Bible study every Wednesday night. It is online, but it's just a few members of our church and a few other people. But, Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, what I love about doing Bible studies is that I see the text through other people's eyes, and it opens up fresh vistas for me. And so even though I've preached on that text a number of times, I thought about the fact that salt is a very peculiar thing, because if you want to taste bacon, you don't just taste salt. And if you take all the salt out of the bacon, you won't even taste the bacon. Salt seems to be the thing by which we taste everything else. And then the next illustration, you are the light of the world. Well, the light illuminates so everything in the world can be seen as it is. And so salt illuminates, because I don't quite know the right word to use, the salt illuminates the flavor of the pork or the bacon so that you can taste bacon. And that's the role of the Christian. And so when I listen to Douglas Murray say this, he's saying, hey, church, we need some salt. We need some light. And my issue is, we don't, even us in the church, we don't always like what we see when Jesus turns the light on. And we don't mind pointing out what we don't like in others, but it's part of the reason we say you can't see God and live is because Jesus is the light. And when he shines his light on me, can I live with myself from what I see myself? So this is a big, complex issue. But when I listen to Jordan Peterson and Douglas Murray and Tom Holland and people on the left, at least, also, there's two things wrong that the church, if it says to either side of them, oh yes, you're so right, and sort of takes up their mantra. No, the The church has some things that we say that will be accepted and some things that we say that won't be welcome. But at least Douglas Murray, I think, recognizes that and says, okay, I'm not going to like everything that you have to say, but still talk, because otherwise, what's your point? And that he's dead on right about.
Which is to be preaching its gospel, to be asserting its truths and its claims. And so when one sees it falling into all of the latest tropes, one just thinks, well, that's another thing gone. It's just like absolutely everything else in the era.
Now, he's a conservative, and so he wants to see conservation.
Everything in this boring, monotone, ill thought out and shallow dialectic. And I am, so as I say, I'm a disappointed non-adherent.
I don't know if, Tom, you can help in any way here, but what...
And, part of if you were a part of the church still, your voice would be heard. And part of why the church is so weak is because people flee. Oh, I don't want to have a fight in the church. And, well, yeah, there will always be fights in the church. The church should just learn how to model fighting well.
What, I mean, perhaps you could firstly some thoughts on what Douglas has shared there about his own journey, but also obviously his disappointment in a way as what he sees the church has become today.
I very much understand that. I remember the late great Bishop Stephen Neal, who I knew maybe 30 years ago. He died at a great age around then. Saying that every time he went to a modern Anglican service, he came away with this deep sense of loss because he had grown up, like Douglas, with King James Version and the Book of Common Prayer, and just felt that the contemporary liturgies just didn't cut it. And I get that too. I grew up similarly with very traditional words, etc. I suppose for me, that still remains. I have been able, in many contexts, to go on using traditional liturgies as well as modern ones. But
I think sometimes people want the church to be a museum. And in some places, they've become museums. But they want it to be, in some ways, like we wish museums to be, because when we go to a museum and we see the artifacts, we want that church to be in remembrance, not just mentally, but to be remembered all the way through. And the people in the church have been the ones living in it. And so I remember seeing a documentary on the castle that Downton Abbey was filmed in, and it's a home. And so, well, do you really want the church to be sort of like Plymouth Plantation or Sturbridge Village or Williamsburg or one of these places where people dress up and walk through the motions and you pause and they sort of act like they're part of the 18th century, but they're asking that won't satisfy either. And so in many ways, we're sort of stuck with, well, do we want a living God? And back to C.S. Lewis's great passage, it's repeated in a number of his books on pantheism, where, we went looking for God. Well, what happens when you see him staring back? And what happens if you dare believe he's going looking for you and he has designs on your life, and he's not a consumer, he's not a customer service representative, moralistic therapeutic deism, that is saying, oh, how may I help you? He's looking and saying, no, you're going to help me. That's a living God. Is that the God we want to find?
But for me, the essence of it isn't so much the words and the culture and so on. And obviously that's a very English, British, actually English thing, the Book of Common Prayer and the King James Bible. And I've been privileged to know Christians from many, many different backgrounds, many different parts of the world. And particularly when I was Bishop of Durham, I was able to see, we had 250 parishes in the diocese, very wide range from traditional to modern to this to that. But I was able to see the church at work, the church being the church on the street, the church being the one group to whom the local council could turn to find out what on earth was going on that terrible sink estate or whatever it was.
Now, this is sort of where we get into salt and light again, because if you're tasting bacon and it's properly salted, you taste the bacon. If you're walking through a room that is properly illuminated, you see the room. You don't necessarily see the light, you see through the light. And you don't necessarily taste the salt, you taste through the salt. And that's Tom Wright's point here, because, and it's a difficult point to make for people who are outside the church, because it's more difficult for them to see the breadth of the church and what all is going on. And partly because leaders in the church, at least good leaders in the church, are always paying attention not necessarily to the outcomes, but to the process. Because the leaders usually can't create outcomes, and the only ways to actually address outcomes are to address the process. And any church, anybody who does any significant church works knows process is extremely messy.
And to see the church actually caring for people, being the family for the familyless, etc. Not all churches do that, but that gave me this wonderful sense that all the theory that I as a theologian knew ought to be happening was happening on the street in some of the places that never hit the news and never hit the newspapers and never get quoted on the radio or whatever. But there are many, many, many ordinary Christians, not that there are ordinary Christians, but you know what I mean, who are simply doing Christianity at ground level. And that's the thing that is so exciting. And
it's the salt you don't taste because you're tasting the bacon. It's the light you don't see because you're using the light to look at the room.
I think when you see that, you look across at the new atheists, and it's rather like people who, like Douglas and me, love classical music, overhearing a conversation between people who are tone deaf. You just think, well, it's a great shame for you that you don't get it, because actually this world of music is so rich and amazing. And that's how I feel about the new atheists. It's too bad. And yes, there are arguments, but actually the arguments aren't necessarily the crucial thing. What matters is something else, which...
Poor Justin trying to break in. You get the preacher rolling, and yeah, I know.
Many, many people still have. And we talk about post-Christian.
You could make a meme of the... This is what Justin is doing there.
In Britain or Europe, but actually there are many new Christian movements, confusing often, and often getting muddled and so on, as we all do. But there's a great deal to be encouraged by, as well as, and as Douglas knows, I share his frustration when it appears that the church is simply jumping on the latest trendy bandwagon. I mean, one quick example, and then I'll shut up.
Justin's like, he's going to land the plane. Oh, he's going back up.
10 years ago, when the debate on women bishops was really getting going, David Cameron in the House of Commons said rather disdainfully about the Church of England, yes, it's time they got on with it. They should get with the programme. And I wrote a cross article for the Times to say, no, we are, I hope, going to have women bishops, not because it's the programme that our society is moving in some sort of spurious, progressive idea, but because right from the beginning, the first person who Jesus told to go and tell other people that he'd been raised from the dead was a woman, that the foundation of the apostolic ministry comes with Mary Magdalene on the day, on Easter Day. And from there, it's all downhill. So I totally agree the church shouldn't just be jumping on the agendas. It should be exploring more what is in its own textbook.
Now, it was interesting because I was watching some of the live chat during this conversation, and see right there, and the women in, I'm probably going to do some videos on women in leadership because as I'm doing videos about the impending civil war and potential dissolution of my own denomination over same-sex marriage, these issues have to be gotten with, and people on the progressive end will say, well, the church needs to be the vanguard. Yeah, but they need to be the vanguard of what they're supposed to be the vanguard of. And because what we usually see is the church sort of being the, keeping up the rear. Ryan Bell, a few years ago, decided he was going to be a year of being an atheist, which to absolutely no one's surprise led to a continuation of being an atheist, which to absolutely no one's surprise led to, the continued sort of path of deconstruction coming from in his case, I think he was Seventh-day Adventist, into just sort of being a presence on Twitter that spouts progressive politics. And in some ways, my blogging in my denomination, and in other ways, my part of my interest in Jordan Peterson was, while Christianity is in many ways a progressivist religion, and the progressivism in the Western culture in general is in many ways a variant of Christian progressivism, what the church always must do is sharpen the focus and say, now, how exactly does this work? And how do we bear witness to the coming kingdom of Christ and not have different other progressivisms? Can we understand where they come from? And again, Dominion, can we understand where they come from? And, Tom Holland was one of the first bigger voices that had been making, when I discovered Tom Holland, I thought, he's singing my song, because I had been saying, and you can find it on my videos before I ever found Tom Holland, on Unbelievable, because that's where I saw him, that no, these struggles are Christian struggles. And what in some ways were really, and I haven't been able to bring these ideas quite to sharpen focus enough, is the real questions we're dealing with are in some ways the questions of the Protestant church and the questions of the Protestant Reformation, which I've talked about before, but the questions of, okay, how do we understand church in this multi-platformed world? Because what's happening in the United States, in the UK, in Canada, in Australia are movements of Christianity sorting itself out in these ways, and that will come to fruition quite soon where this is going to go. How much time tonight will I have to do this video? Well, we'll see.
Just before we get to that Spectator article that Tom responded to, Douglas, just staying with the new atheism for a moment, because in a sense, arguably, that has been part of the story of how we have, ended up in an increasingly post-Christian West.
And nobody has covered it better than Justin Brierley. Justin Brierley was on this beat. I first found Justin Brierley when I was playing around with podcasts before I had smartphones. I had these little MP3 players that I would download things on the internet and put them on a card and put them in my MP3 player or play them from my computer. And Justin Brierley was doing this with his radio program. And so, Justin is in many ways a pioneer in this, and all of the gifts that he demonstrates in these programs are bought with time.
But I know that you were friends with one of the great new atheists, Christopher Hitchens. So did you disagree with him when you were, having lunch as friends and that sort of thing? What was your relationship with the new atheists? Did you outgrow them? I don't know.
I think I'm friends with all of them. Some still. I remember I knew Christopher around the time that I started to lose my own faith, and I had been asked. Actually, it was in the Spectator. We always have a Christmas sort of poll of writers, politicians, and others, and asked them a question. And that year, it must have been about 2008. That year, the question was, "Do you believe in the virgin birth?" And I think it was the last time I said, certainly in print, maybe the first as well. I said, "Yes, of course." And I remember I saw Christopher in Washington a little while later. We've known each other for some years, reviewed a number of my books. And I remember he raised this over a drink in his apartment. He said, "I saw your answer in the Spectator." And I remember thinking, oh gosh. And he said, "You could have knocked me over with a feather. I didn't know you." And he sort of said something like, "I didn't know you were that way." He was very shocked, very, very shocked. And we agreed not to discuss it at the following lunch.
And that is just it's these little issues that make individuals like Douglas Murray so fascinating. Virgin birth, yeah, of course. But I just can't believe Christianity, because I look at you all. I mean, Gandhi basically made the same argument. I look at you all and I think, well, if you really were followers of that Jesus that I read about in the Gospels, wouldn't you look different? Yeah, if I was a better follower, I'd look different. But can you be a little clearer on exactly what you mean? Because in what ways, and this is, one side looks at Jesus and say, oh, Jesus would feel like a warm bath. And I think, have you read the Gospels? I mean, there are times that his disciples are just afraid of him. And I've seen pastors that people should be afraid of, because they're full of anger and they're full of, they're people are afraid of them for all the reasons that people should be afraid of bad people. But they're afraid of Jesus just because he just keeps breaking their frames, and they don't know what to do with him, but yet they can't leave him. And again, not in the sense of a bad, an abusive spouse, but in the sense of, well, I kind of want to worship him, but I'm terrified of him. Yeah, well, that's the God thing.
Yes, I mean, I've spent my life surrounded by people who have strong opinions, and that includes very religious people of many faiths, and many secularists and atheists. I think there has been, as I just alluded to earlier, there's been, I think, a fruitful dialogue in recent years, actually, on this.
I agree. The dialogue is getting more fruitful, I think, as modernity wanes.
Throw one thing in, if I may, which is that one of the things Tom just said alludes to something I find very interesting, which is a retreat that can happen in faith from faith with assertions, ethical claims, and much more, into effectively a social action group. Now, I know that's not what you were referring to, but I'm very interested in the way that this has happened. I've seen it in America. I've seen it in Jewish communities.
Now, it's helpful to listen to what he just said there carefully.
But into faith with assertions, ethical claims, and much more.
Faith with assertions, ethical claims, and much more.
Into effectively a social action group.
Isn't social action all about ethics? And again, this is where Peterson comes in, because, well, we need to know how to act in this world. And religion is the original assumption place where you act. Again, going back to Tom Holland's, were the Greeks religious? We look at them and say, yeah, they're very religious. Well, religion is the operating system. And so if you're looking for fair winds, maybe you'll need to sacrifice your daughter, because with sacrifice, we bargain with the future. These were the ways that you managed the world in the ancient world. And now, after deism and science, we say, well, no, we manage the physical world through these mechanisms. But then we have all these problems with people. So, well, And this is where we don't want the church to be a social action group. Oh, but again, what?
Now, I know ethics from faith with assertions, ethical claims, and much more, into effectively a social action group.
And usually the complaints that people have are basically boiled down. We'd love you to sound like us. And his complaint here, the church sort of just sounds like everything else. Well, not all churches do. Some of them just sound offensive to everyone, and some of them are just darn wrong. But
now, I know that's not what you were referring to, but I'm very interested in the way that this has happened. I've seen it in America. I've seen it in Jewish communities a lot as well. There's actually a term. I would muck it up if I tried to do it in Hebrew now. But there's a term for effectively the doing of good works, and you can see some effectively, basically, non-believing or no longer believing sort of Jewish communities falling into this, saying, well, actually, our Judaism will be doing good works, doing charity and soup kitchens and much more. And I find that very interesting. I find it noble and much more, but I don't think of it as religion. I don't see it as that.
But that is the problem with our word religion and religious, isn't it? That the modern, as in post-18th century, view of religion is precisely something that is divorced from the rest of ordinary life. And that's been reinforced by, I think, an over or misinterpretation of the idea of justification by faith apart from works, as though, okay, if we believe in faith and that sort of religion, you shouldn't be bothered about all that other stuff at all. Whereas
now, this is sort of how Tom Wright, N.T. Wright, I just think of him as N.T. Wright. I differed with N.T. Wright a little bit on the way N.T. Wright packages some of this stuff. And he does it in Simply Christian. He does it in some other ways. I tend to language it a little bit differently. And this is where we're going to get into a little bit of the generations.
Whereas in the New Testament, it's very clear. Paul says on 2 or 3 occasions, if you're in this game, be zealous for good works. And he doesn't mean moral good works to earn your salvation or anything like that. It's that from the very start, the church was designed to be an outward facing, what's going on in this community and how can we help kind of movement.
Now, the way he said that there, this is one of the things that the church very much did and should have done and spinned it off. And he's going to give examples of it. But just with the way he said it, that will sound to Douglas Murray like basically activism, a community development organization. And see, I think the core of it is I was having a conversation with a church planter, and I made the observation that every time Bill Hybels of the Secret Movement used to make the point that if churches don't keep, this stuff gets so complicated, evangelism in the forefront, they don't do it at all. And so churches that decide, well, we're just going to help the poor. Well, you should help the poor. But if you look at the Apostle Paul again, he said, yes, I'm very interested in helping the poor, help the poor all the time. But my mission is not exhausted by poor helping.
And they found that was shocking to many people because there weren't too many other people in the ancient world who lived like that, who were looking out for the poor.
And now we're surrounded by them, including, and this again, the Swiss Reformation, there's a long history of this. But when I listen to how he languages this, and then I think about, well, how does Douglas Murray hear this? There's a reason why I language a lot of this stuff a little bit differently than Tom Wright.
Not only their own poor, but other people's as well. Paul says, while we have time, do good to all people, especially those of the household of faith. But there's a sense that following from Jesus himself, there is that agenda that we are about God's plan to put the world right. And we can't do it all ourselves because it's a much bigger thing than that. But we can be people who are bringing about signs of God's restorative justice in the world.
And I would more emphasize signs of, and you will be my witness. In other words, we practice the life of the age to come, but we do so in the midst of the age of decay. And it looks like Jesus.
And of course, from the outside, that can look like just people running soup kitchens. Well, I'd rather people ran soup kitchens than didn't run soup kitchens, and I'm sure Douglas would agree. But it's actually about...
And again, that demonstrates the point of this book right here, which is, why can we all agree that the poor should be fed? Well, the Apostle Paul himself said, he who does not work shall not eat. But he also was eager to help the poor. Well, the helping the poor is not just, financial, especially in this day when stuff, in this very affluent culture, okay, how, when, where, why, all of that is part of the disruption. And, the specific group of people that Douglas Murray is engaging, see, this is where these generational modulations in very subtle ways, I think, have to be wrestled through in terms of language and messaging, priorities, all of this.
A vision of the whole of life. And if that's why I worry about this word religion and religious, because it didn't mean in the first century what it means now either. So I would rather talk about God the creator and God the reconciler and redeemer of creation, focused of course on Jesus, but with then the followers of Jesus commissioned to do those things which say to the world, there is a different way to be human, and following Jesus is the key to it.
And now we've got being and doing Vervaekean talk.
Yes, you're slightly unusual, or becoming slightly unusual in this regard, in that you're a theologian, a bishop, and a very prominent face in the faith, who does say these things, and this seems to me to be uncommon at the moment, and
And Tom Wright laughs because that's not uncommon at all. It's actually the majority. I don't know about the UK, but certainly in the United States, it's the majority that, might tinker with some of the way Tom laid it out, but the majority of people going to church sort of see it that way.
What one hears from prominent bishops, archbishops even, is an attempt to slip into the rhetoric of the era, and indeed slip into the ethics and the ethical claims of the era, without making those foundational assertions that, as I say, I think that many people are hungry for.
Now, I don't know the way it is in the UK, but in the United States, there is definitely an issue of people who are outside the church seeing church through the mass media for their own reasons, for narratives within the political realm, within the media realm. I remember all the way into the 2000s, every now and then coming across some breathless piece in a major publication saying things like, churches are using drums and guitars. Yeah, they have been for 40 years. This is a new thing. Not really. And in the United States, many, many people have noted that the reporters that worked for mass media, those jobs are disappearing fast. The reporters that worked for mass media very seldom had any idea or contextualization of the religious people that would sort of stand up and be covered. And so if you if you look at a political rally and you see people with religious symbolism, it's like, well, there's religious people. Well, yeah, but there's a lot of religious people. And so then, okay, you read Pew survey, and Pew does good surveys. And so, they're not, media isn't necessarily making things up out of whole cloth, but to gain context is difficult, and the nuance needed to sort of work through the issues is important.
And is
yes.
this where the issue of the article, let's go to that and put, name that elephant in the room. But Douglas published an article which was highly critical of the Church of England's current approach to anti-racism and so on, Tom, and feeling that they were essentially bowing to a sort of certain woke ideology, essentially, and not sort of doing what they should do as the church. So what was your response to that? And how much truth is there in Douglas's concerns about the direction of the church?
Having since read Douglas's book, The Madness of Crowds, I see more clearly than I did at the time where the energy for Douglas's article was coming from, because clearly Douglas has mapped out in, as I said before, a rather disturbing way, the large movements often rooted in various forms of early 20th century Marxism connected with Foucault and people like that, that have then generated some of these great movements.
Tom Wright is 71 years old. That means he was born roughly around 1950, which means he came of age in the mid-60s, where the civil rights movement in many ways captured the imagination of the world. I mean, listening to Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook mentioning in the podcast The Rest is History that there were anti-Vietnam protests in the UK when they weren't even in the war. So their episode on Americanization was actually tremendous to give me a little bit of perspective of what's going on out there in the UK with respect to these things. Now, what happened for the generation of Tom Wright and T. Wright and my father's generation, who all of us are sort of these moderate Christians who on one hand say, yes, racism is real. Yes, racism continues to be real. The question is how to calibrate. But this generation has been so instinctively impressed by second wave racism, not third wave racism, second wave racism, that they sort of are rushing to the fore. And at this point, people like Tom Wright, Tim Keller have a lot of status. And so they come to the fore and basically get up to the mic and make their anti-racist comments. But the groundwork has changed so that what would have been heard a certain way in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and aughts now is heard completely differently in the 20-teens and now the 2020s. And so what Tom just said about, oh, I read your book. Oh, now I understand, because Tom Wright also knows, philosophy and history. And, oh, I have a much better idea of where you're coming from. But when I heard what you wrote, I read it through my filters and as sort of a moderate reacted. But now my position's a little different.
And then to see the church getting on board with that, you think, hang on, what's going on? My initial response was, this is actually a problem that Jesus himself faced. He says at one point that the kingdom of God is breaking in violently, but the men of violence are trying to get in on the act.
That is, the fact that he quoted that verse is fascinating, because this is one of the most difficult verses to understand in the Gospels. It is so thoroughly debated. He quotes this verse. A little bit later, Douglas Murray's going to quote the same verse with a different translation. Part of the reason you don't hear them as being the same verse is because if you take a whole bunch of contemporary Bibles and sort of lay them out and go to that verse, you'll find it rendered so completely differently. And when I try to teach people a little bit about how to read the Bible, I'll say, well, if you can't read Greek, get some different translations and sort of, you can do this on computer now. It used to be put it on a table. Just line them up and you see, wow, This translation varies greatly in this verse. That's because the editors behind the contemporary translations are struggling to figure out how to render this. And that Tom Wright uses this verse in this context, in this way, I found fascinating.
In ultimately a problem that Jesus himself faced. He says at one point that the kingdom of God is breaking in violently, but the men of violence are trying to get in on the act. In other words, there were other people saying it's time for the kingdom of God at the same time as Jesus was. Did that?
And this, so if you follow any of my rough drafts at all, you'll notice that the deep question within the Gospels is, what do we mean by this word Messiah? What is this kingdom? How does it come? What are the means by which it comes? Now, Tom Wright keeps saying the means by which it comes is the church's service on its knees to the poor and to the world. And he's exactly right. That's exactly what Jesus does. But now in this context, Douglas Murray sort of wants the church to come up and give a shove back. And we don't usually shove because, there's that money changing thing, but at the center of our faith is a man on the cross. And that's usually how we conquer. We keep losing culture wars, but winning the long-term war. Your confusion is part of our strategy. And so I actually really like Tom Wright's take on this verse, because it's a very difficult verse to figure out what's going on. And he's basically saying that, sort of in a line with my reading of the Judean culture war, and that he's in that sense contrasting himself with the Zealots, because everybody wants Jesus to storm Jerusalem and take back the nation for God. And all of these messages, well, Jesus is going to storm the kingdom of Satan exactly by the way that he dies. I've been working on Rene Girard. I can't say it the way Jonathan Peugeot can say it. Been working on Rene Girard. What do we mean by Satan? This is one of the, at any given time, there's 4 or 5 different issues that are sort of in the back. And at some point, they may or may not come out the front in terms of a video. But Jesus is assaulting Satan's kingdom. Remember, Satan takes him to a high mountain and shows him the kingdom and says, all of these belong to me. Well, what do you mean by that? All of these work my way to get my way in the world. And Jesus says, I don't work that way. I'm not part of your kingdom. And so they crucify Jesus, because that makes it look like, well, Jesus loses. I prefer my Messiahs uncrucified. It makes it look like Jesus loses. And Jesus is like, oh, you don't understand, do you? Which is why you fell into my trap. You thought I was losing. But every time I lose in this way, I actually win. Surely this man is the Son of God. People, the crowd, anxious for Jesus' crucifixion. We're going to watch the blood sport. We're going to watch Jesus get owned. Leaves the crucifixion disturbed. We thought we would enjoy this. We thought we would enjoy Jesus getting owned. Instead, he dies like a lamb to the slaughter. But he's not up there either cursing, trying to get back with feeble words, or begging, trying to get off by becoming their inferior. No, Jesus composes himself and says, I know exactly what I'm doing through this whole crucifixion. And so then even in his resurrection, he doesn't stomp up to Pilate and bang on the door and say, how do you like me now, Pontius? He doesn't go to Herod and say, you want to see tricks? Touch this. He doesn't do any of that. Goes to his disciples and says, do you see what just happened? This is the cup that you asked to drink from, and you will, and we will. And to the world, it looks like losing. But actually, this is how we win. So I love what N.T. Wright is doing with this verse and saying, yeah, violent people are trying to get in on the game because you think the game is Satan's game on the top of the mountain, where it's going to be my well-being at your expense, and where it's going to be bow before the sword, because if you don't, the sword will be against you. And Jesus says, if anybody's blood is to be shed, let it be mine first. That's how I win. What do you mean, win that way? Well, if you don't believe in the resurrection, it's harder to believe he didn't win. But then again, we're still talking about him. Most people don't even know about the failed insurgency of 67 to 70 or the Bar Kokhba revolt. Tom Wright knows all about those.
Did that mean that Jesus should give up talking about the kingdom of God? No, it meant he had to go on explaining what he reckoned it did mean, as opposed to what the other people were saying. And so there is bound to be a
Jesus engaged in his culture's culture war, but in a very confusing way, even to the point that my pet theory is that why did Judas sell him? Because he was probably finally frustrated and disappointed in the manner in which Jesus understood Messiah. Because Judas was looking for something that would storm Jerusalem to take it back for God or something like that. And instead, Jesus storms Satan's hall and says, you have no power over me. Can't you see that? I gave myself up to you, and I'm still here. That's how Christians reign.
Confusing convergence between a genuine Jesus-following desire to see, for instance, social justice. It's written right across the New Testament that there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, no male and female, that God made all humans of a single stock, and so on. This is
and again, for someone of Tom Wright's generation, social justice, that's part of the witness of the church. But now the word has sort of flipped. And part of me says, I'm not willing to surrender that word. I'm not willing to surrender justice, because a generation ago, people didn't want the justice of God because they saw God as holy. Now, basically taking, this is Satan's tool, justice is mere retribution. That's Satan's kingdom. Jesus' kingdom, well, is very different. And the funny thing about Jesus' kingdom is you can't beat it with the sword.
Is basic, and how that got forgotten in the last few hundred years is a shameful story in the Western Church. So that I think the church needs to reclaim what was always part of its heritage, a view of the renewal of the whole human race and a new sort of family in which identity, that's one of our straplines for tonight, identity.
Ooh, we've had a little pause on.
Pro tip, fiber, not cable, definitely not DSL, fiber.
Tom's video there, hoping it'll come back in just a moment's time. We are live on our live stream tonight, but the point being that Tom was making there, Douglas, that we are looking, the Bible has always had, and Christianity specifically, this idea of an identity. Sorry, I think Tom's back. So Tom, do you want to finish your point? You just got interrupted by the internet for a moment.
Sorry, I wasn't sure where we broke off.
It was just, you were saying in the Bible, it's always been about the neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female,
yes.
slave nor free, one identity.
And about the point from Acts 17, where Paul says on the Areopagus, hey, God made all people from the same stuff, from the same stock. We belong together. And rather than, and of course, then we get into the trap, which Douglas has written about as well, of the modern idea that we're all identical, including there being no difference between male and female, etc., versus the postmodern idea, which collapses into dozens of different competing identities, each trying to claim the high ground of the victim, etc., etc. And again, I think Douglas and I are on the same page on this one. But then my point would be that the church, in being true to itself and not simply relying on contemporary, rather shallow ethical maxims, but being true to its original gospel, actually has the makings of doing what at its best some of the woke ideologies are seeking to do, which is a genuine passion for justice. Forget the fact that the Marxists have come in on the act. Of course they have, because if the church misses out half of its agenda, it shouldn't be surprised if other people come rushing in from the side to fill it in. So that's where the issue, I think, has to lie. But I was grateful for what Douglas said, because it seems to me if an elderly theologian has anything to offer to the world, it may be the reminder of some of the deeper, richer stuff which is out there, which is in the Bible, for goodness sake, and which can refresh and renew a vision of what we all should be about.
In other words, and I love this, because I agree with, I basically agree exactly with what Tom Wright says here. And so if you look at my conversation with Sevilla King, in many ways, being anti-woke has some of the same pitfalls as being woke, because it is parasitic, it is reactive, and what Tom is basically saying is, no, you need to get to the bottom. Is racism real? Absolutely. How do you combat racism? Well, you don't do it with what's amazing, because what's amazing in a lot of the woke takeover of religion is that, well, you're going to lose repentance and forgiveness, and you're actually not going to get anywhere because you're using Satan's tools. You're just going to shame and browbeat and bully people. That doesn't change hearts. You get outward compliance. And trust me, the church has done this forever. And in some ways, Douglas Murray's, if he wanted to engage in this way in this video, could say, well, then the church sort of did that to the gay community for a long time. And the church constantly has to deal with the way the church employs Satan's tools. But Tom's point is, well, actually, if you want to fight racism, you're not going to do it by yelling racist at a bunch of people. You're probably going to do it by loving your enemies. Those are the tools of Christ. And the reason we don't believe in them is because they're costly tools.
Go ahead, Douglas.
Yes, I think this is very important. It gets to another point I've written about Fairmount in recent years, which is, I think, Justin, I think maybe when we spoke before, we spoke about this, that sometimes people claim that the sort of public ethics of the time are sort of non-existent. That's not quite true. They're trying to dig down in quite a forceful way at the moment. What I was writing about in that article was just one example of that. But as I think I said to you when we spoke before, what I think of as being the most striking failure of the time is the failure to embed any ethic that does not rely on the Christian ethic in regards to the equality of everyone in the eyes of God. Our age is struggling very badly with an attempt to replace that ethic or find another way to do it. And there are various ways which it's tried to do that. Human rights ideology is one way, fairly developed, but I think not successful. And another is effectively the landing on equity as the answer, when it can't be the answer. But I see what people are struggling to do, which is to try to maintain and hold on to this exceptionally important gift of the Christian inheritance. Without the idea of equality in the eyes of God and the value of every individual in the eyes of God, you are left with these attempts to assert that, for instance, everyone is the same,
Yes.
or can be. And it's clear that we can't be and that we aren't. It's one of the great
Yes.
things.
And here, Douglas Murray, it's just like Jordan Peterson and Tom Holland in many ways, say it better than the Christians can. That's a kind of Christian victory where your critics, where in a sense the Holy Spirit moves through your critics, those who are outside the church. I mean, again, during the first Jordan Peterson wave, my favorite typology of Jordan Peterson is the unauthorized exorcist of the Gospel of Mark. Why? Because in a sense, Douglas Murray and Tom Holland are doing that too. They're exorcising demons from the culture. Well, what do you mean by demons? You have to listen to my question and answer a little bit. And this is where, I'm eventually talking my way into a video where I take on the language of Satan and the demons. Peugeot again. I mean, I've learned a lot from Peugeot in this. He took that on with his treatment of the Lil Nas X video, which of course is sort of a juvenile way to get a reaction. And in our culture, such juvenile ways to get reactions can make you rich. The plea here has to be heard loud and clear by Christians. And when someone as articulate as Douglas Murray makes the case better than, same with Jordan Peterson, makes the case better than they hear Christians making it. And Christians ought to be silent and listen and repentant in some ways. And again, I want to be fair to both sides. Again, I could use Douglas Murray the other way. When Christians have to look at their track record against slaves, Jews, gays, people of other ethnic groups, Christians ought to be silent and repentant. It's just, for Christians, our repentance and silence doesn't just stop with us. It goes all the way down. And we have a Heavenly Father that says, I know you're sinful, and for this I sent my Son. And so repentance is not fruitless. Repentance comes with confession yields repentance, and repentance yields, the pronouncement of forgiveness and misery, deliverance, gratitude, and then grateful pursuit, Heidelberg Catechism from my tradition, grateful pursuit of renewed obedience. That tends to be the way I frame it. Grateful pursuit of renewed obedience, not in this, we're going to make the world right. Oh, we're not that good. The Holy Spirit does the work. He uses us sometimes, but he uses Douglas Murray here, and he uses Jordan Peterson, and he uses Tom Holland. And they might feel a little awkward at the thought that this Christian God is using them, but hey, this is the parable of the talents, or the mina. I knew you were a stern master. You reap where you did not plow, and you bring in what your people didn't seem to set up. Yeah, he's that kind of God too. So
if you take away the worry about the loss of the foundation, then it's fine. We can live with it.
Christians have been worrying about the loss of foundation for a long time. And I think Christianity often does poorly in the public sphere. And I think we've seen this in the United States when Christians sort of wade into the public sphere and say to those who are not Christians, you should be more Christian. Christians do a lot better when those who are outside the church look into the church and say, you should be no more Christian. Yeah, you're right. We should. Do you want to join me in that? I'd love to do it with you. Let's talk about what this Christianity is and why we take the kinds of risks and have the kinds of belief we have in it.
I very much see Douglas's point. from where I sit, the only way really to get this sorted is, to use a trite phrase, to go back to Jesus, because in the Jesus of the Gospels, as opposed to the Jesus of much popular imagination, you find a rigorous re-inhabiting of the entire Jewish tradition and a redirection of this vision of what would it look like if God was in charge. That's the question of the kingdom of God. Just supposing God was in charge, how would it look? Well, it might look like a man who had two sons and one did this and one. It might look like, and then he heals somebody in the crowd, whatever it is. It's a renewal of human beings, not in order to be identikit, we're all equal now, but in order to be certainly equally valued and equally, though uniquely in themselves, part of an ongoing program that God has launched, not human beings at this point. And so when I then come forward into the 20th and 21st centuries.
And again, when he said, I mean, and this is part of the continuing work on language, because what God has launched, and right there, the agency of this God and the way that Christians have been able to language this and have languaged this for a very, very long time, it's some of that Christians have to figure out, okay, how can I communicate that in a way that, even Douglas Murray, they could say, I believe in the virgin birth. Okay. I think, again, I'm back to God number one and God number two. God number one is the Arenic God. He's the God of, at least in the Heidelberg Catechism, Lord's Day 10. The God who the Ezekiel Kaufman, the meta-divine realm, not for the Jews, their God functions arenically and agentically, God number two. And so figuring out how to say what he just said in a way that is once again heard, God as arena and agent, and the relationship between those two things.
With that, I find myself saying, when I was young, we watched traditional morality go out of the window. It was sex in the 60s. It was money in the 80s. We don't need to obey the old rules. We're going to do it differently. We're the modern world now. And then what's happened is the invention of, and I think Douglas and I agree on this, the invention of neo-moralisms, which is what the woke ideology is really all about. And it reminds me sometimes of, I think it was Caligula, the Roman emperor, or it might have been Nero, I'm getting this wrong, it's late at night, who put new laws up so high that nobody could read them, and then...
Talk to Mark Lefebvre about the Billy Graham shrine. Why are those verses way up high? Over Vakey notes, when you look your head up psychologically, what are you doing? But I love this example that N.T. Wright gives.
And blamed or punished people for not obeying these new laws that he just invented. And that's very much what's going on at the moment. It's as though society can't live without morality, but if you've banished all the older moralities, you've got to invent some more from the ground up. And we're doing it on a very flimsy basis, it seems.
It also goes back to what you mentioned, the Cameron comment, which is what exactly is the project? Because there's an added cruelty, isn't there, to this, to as it were, writing the laws in a place where they cannot be read. There's an added cruelty if you haven't even finished writing them yet, and you tell people to get with them.
Quite.
And that is exactly what's happening in culture. That's exactly what's happening. And again, you don't want to be Douglas Murray's adversary when he has a pen in his hand or when he has a microphone in front of his mouth. I mean, what Douglas Murray can do, wow.
So one of the questions underneath our era is what exactly are the laws? What are the rules here? The Christian ethic has a set of rules. They can be debated around endlessly, as everyone present knows. But there are foundations to them you cannot deny. They're not wholly abstract.
No.
The era we're in. The era we're in.
They are to do with the goodness of. Sorry.
When we don't know.
Yeah. But the Christian morality, it seems to me, is to do with the goodness of creation but the need for recreation, for redemption and recreation, but a recreation which doesn't say, forget the old ways, we'll do it totally differently. I mean, which is what we've got in a lot of society at the moment. Oh, just don't worry about what everyone used to think, we're going to do it totally differently. We're going to change the meaning of words as well as the meaning of behavior, but rather to say, no, try seeing the world from the perspective of a good and wise creator who is revealed in 1,000 ways, whether it's music or beauty or whatever it is, as well as the structures of reality. But this world is out of joint, and the great Jewish vision, and again, I knew and am grieving about Jonathan Sacks, bless him. He saw this so clearly, the great Jewish vision of God's passion for the world to restore the world, and the vocation of the people of God to be somehow modeling that and showing it forth and saying, this is a self-evidently good way to be human. And so it isn't just thinking through ethical theory, it's about how the community actually lives. And for me, again, this is all about following and worshiping Jesus. And that.
Jonathan Peugeot, Jordan Peterson, attention. We're going to have to get at the McGilchrist video. That's a biggie.
I know that was folly to the Greeks and scandalous to the Jews in the first century, and it still is today. But if you put that as the coping stone in the middle, everything else will actually fall into place.
Hey, that practically a Peugeot move right there. Way to go, Tom Wright.
Coming back to you then, Douglas, given that you, to some extent, you're both in agreement on the fact that to lose the Christian story and the moral underpinnings that's given culture leaves everyone scrabbling to kind of essentially invent their own morality, and everyone gets very confused and angry with each other in the process. I mean, where do we go from here, I suppose, is the question. And is there a way back even to what now? It's the genie's sort of out of the bottle, though, isn't it? I mean, can we go back to that once Christian age where apparently everyone was more or less agreed on things?
Yes, I say that in The Strange Death of Europe. You can't wish things you know and wish them unknown, or wish them unlearned. And this is something I think is very important in all dialogue between believers and non-believers.
That struck me as a very interesting statement. I want to play it again because I don't think I really have it down. I mentioned to Rick this morning, because we of course did the question and answer. I messaged to Rick this morning. Part of the reason I do these commentary videos is that I'm so ADHD, I'm doing this while I'm listening to this and doing this. This forces me to sit down when I find a video that I say, this is an important one, to sit down and, okay. And then why do I do commentary? Because the commentary is a part of the appropriation, the digestion, the taking it in, it's settling, it's putting it in my brain. That's why I do this. And the fact that you all watch it just is wonderful for me, and then you write comments and you share your thoughts on it and you let me know what you think, because you broaden me and you help me understand that way.
Think is known. You can't wish things you know and wish them unknown.
More or less agreed on things.
Yes, I say that in The Strange Death of Europe. You can't wish things you know and wish them unknown, or wish them unlearned. And this is something I think is very important in all dialogue between believers and non-believers.
I wish you'd expand on that. I have a sense that there's something there, but I don't capture it.
I just wanted to say, I wouldn't like it to be anyone to take away from this, that I simply think that the church has a PR problem. It isn't just that I think that the presentation is
100% agreed.
Is wrong, or there's a mistake in, for instance, falling into the religion of anti-racism or anything else. It's that I do believe that doing that means that the church fails to tell its own story. We had an article,
or even worse, doesn't know its own story,
in the Spectator, I think last week, from my friend, former Bishop Michael Nazir Ali. He made a very powerful point about the figures in the church, for instance, who were profoundly anti-slavery. and not just Wilberforce, but Charlemagne and others who saints in the 7th century, Christian saints in the 7th century, who were martyred and objected to the slavery in their own time. There is, what I'm trying to say is that it's not just there is a PR misunderstanding, it seems to me, within the church, and it's missing a trick. It is that this is not a fair summary of the Christian story. It isn't a fair summary of the story of the church. And what it is the adoption of a facile and profoundly hostile analysis of the church, which sees the church, for instance, as being a white enterprise. But it clearly isn't. Like Tom Wright has seen congregations across the world. I've been at services throughout the Middle East, across Africa, beleaguered communities sometimes.
Christianity, whites in Christianity are the minority. There's no question about that. You look at Africa, Asia, Latin America, with this sort of European way of categorizing white and people of color. Christians are a minority in the church.
You show absolutely extraordinary and inspiring levels of faith. And I don't recognize the negative interpretation of the church, which I see from some people trying to force a different ethical.
The new atheists are a big part of that. And in a lot of ways, the mass media picked up and followed the new atheists in a lot of this. Not all, but, I think about Nicholas Kristof and following around doctors in Africa and noting, gosh, a lot of these are missionaries and they could make good livings in North America. And they're pouring out their lives to help these people live.
On the church today. But as I say, it's not just in the history of the church, but in the story that the church has to tell about itself today that I think that there is an error being made. Because, for instance, to go back to something which, as Tom Wright knows, I wrote about in The Madness of Crowds, if you look at the great error of the ideology which is trying to embed today, it is that it has spent no time bothering itself over the question of forgiveness. Now, it's not just that I think that the church is missing a PR trick in not addressing this. I think that the church does everybody in society the most enormous disservice if it doesn't say, this is what our faith is built upon. We have been thinking about this and trying to practice it at least for millennia. So at least give us your ear for a moment.
Now, he's right, of course, but it's sort of the sneaky way in which the church reigns that, well, when churches, and I've seen this now with the woke business, when should, Esther sent me a message on this too, should you, it's the illustration he's going to make right now. Should you forgive Dylan Root? Should you forgive the killer of those little Amish girls in Pennsylvania Dutch country? The church still practices this.
Yeah. And that's really important. I was talking to a good friend just this morning on email who has been writing a short article about wokeness, and he wanted me to comment. And I said, the one thing you need to point out is that all the woke morality is simply about you guys are wrong and you guys are wrong and you're full of hate and you're this and you're that. And there is no sense that if you repent, we'll forgive you. No. You just have to grovel. And it's a morality of, I hate to use the word Pharisaism because actually that's a slur on the first century Pharisees, but that's what in the popular discourse it's about. It's about we've got this right and we're making up new laws as we go along, as Douglas has said. And you lot are wrong and you're staying wrong and we're glad you're wrong and we're going to rub your noses in the dirt. And it seems to me that's rather like certain revolutions. I mean, revolutions that eat their own children, where the French Revolution notoriously ended up decapitating quite a lot of people who had been among the leaders of the early movement. And it's more complicated than that.
It strikes me that in everything you've said there, that in a sense, though, just even if we are in a quote unquote post-Christian world, we're not in a less religious world, in the sense that these ideologies become quite religious, but not in a very grace-filled kind of religion. And you've spoken about that yourself, Douglas, that there's that kind of aspect to the way people then grasp certain identities and certain causes and ideologies, and that becomes their sort of their identity, their religion. And I suppose this is the problem, isn't it? We are meaning-seeking, story-driven creatures, and if it's not going to be the story of Christianity, it's going to be another story.
Yes.
And the question is, can we
When's John Vervaeke coming on Unbelievable? Oh,
live together with these very different stories, which often bump up against each
John Vervaeke would be great on Unbelievable. I don't know. Our little corner of the internet is a little too nice, and I know Justin is an expert at putting, verbal pugilists in the ring and moderating between them, and so our little corner of the internet sort of majors in dialogos
other.
Yes,
but I think that's.
Sorry, Douglas, go ahead, and then Tom respond.
Oh, okay. I think this is true. I've often thought, I hesitate to say this if I'm such a distinguished theologian, but I've often thought that one of the interesting points about what Jesus teaches is that much of it, as Tom Wright well knows, much of it you can find in some of the contemporary Greek thought. Some of the thought is around the Roman world, but nothing prepares for the demand to love your enemy. It seems to me so completely revolutionary and so completely counterintuitive that it has that, and I think we recognize, if I may say so, I think we recognize in our era as well, with awe when we see this being practiced. That's why I come back to this, that it's not just about missing a trick. It's missing an opportunity to display your faith. When people see actual forgiveness, it is, I think, among the most humbling, most moving things that you can ever witness as a human being.
And this because of the work of Christ being deeply embedded in our culture. That sensitivity is itself a product of Christianity. And as Douglas Murray said before, it is not self-evident. The Romans, oh, you wish to grovel? Okay.
An example a couple of years ago when at a church in the South of America,
the South of America, not South America.
Usual, but appalling crime when a young white crazed sort of white supremacist of some kind walked into a church and shot some of the worshippers. And the next day there was an interview with, it was a black congregation, and the next day there was an interview with one of the families, and the mother of somebody who just lost her son said that she forgave the killer of her son. I thought this a couple of years ago. I was doing a tour with somebody who became a friend, Cornell.
And I was going to say Cornell West. His mother just passed away, actually. And his mother, so our church secretary here, one church is not enough for her. She has to have two. And so she goes to, she knows Cornell West's mother quite well, and so goes to the same church as her, and her mother just passed away. And so I was just talking with her about the service, which was on Zoom. But it was not incidental that this man was a Christian minister, and that the troops that he mobilized in his nonviolent movement had themselves been practicing and immersed in the words of nonviolence for generations. And again, in something which gets nowhere near enough attention, that the strange thing about Christianity is that the slaves of brutality adopt and best their masters with the religion of the oppressor, that the oppressed take up and,
Cornell West Professor Cornell West of Harvard, who, by his own definition, is a revolutionary Christian socialist. So we have a lot to disagree about. I was very struck. Cornell always refers to people as brother this, brother that. Some people think it's an annoying tick of his. I rather like it. But I was absolutely bowled over one day when he referred to this shooting. And he said, that brother who went into that church and shot up that congregation. And I was so moved and so amazed that he would refer even to this person who had done this unforgivable thing by any analysis, an unforgivable thing.
And Tom Wright's just smiling. He says, he's preaching for me, baby.
Would still refer to this man as his brother. It seemed, and it seems to me this is an example of living and displaying a Christian ethic, which, if it was just seen a bit more, would have a profound impression in the world.
I totally agree with Douglas there. And again, I want to stress that the problem with that is that you can't just do it by you and me saying, and anyone else who's listening, by the way, you should be going out and getting on with it, though we all should, and it is difficult, but yes. But it can only ultimately become instantiated in a community and in the settled habits of somebody's life when you have at the heart of the faith the story of Jesus going to the cross to defeat the powers of evil. Because without that, then forgiveness is a lovely idea for other people to practice, but too hard for me, as it were. But if
C.S. Lewis's great line, everybody thinks forgiveness is a good idea until they have something to forgive.
Jesus has actually dealt with evil in his death, whatever that means, and you have to have lots of discussions about how that plays out, of course, then who am I to go on actually holding it against this person or that person? And that's why forgiveness then has as its positive side reconciliation. Forgiveness shouldn't just leave you with, as it were, a zero bank balance. It ought then to open the way for reconciliation. That's, of course, what Archbishop Desmond Tutu has done so spectacularly. And I know South Africa is still a very difficult and dangerous place. But when I was young, we were all talking about the coming bloodbath in South Africa. And the fact that there wasn't a bloodbath and that there was a peaceful transition of power was largely due to the fact that Tutu and a lot of others were going and praying with leading politicians, reading the Bible with them. And then when the transition happened, having that amazing commission of truth and reconciliation, with white thugs and black thugs confessing their sins, seeking reconciliation. That should still be sending a shockwave around the world, both in Northern Ireland and in the Middle East. Heaven help us what's going on at the moment, and so on and so on. This is the only way to live, ultimately. But you can only even glimpse a chance of doing it if you've got Jesus himself in the middle. I'm sorry to sound like a cracked record.
And again, I mean, I'm not disagreeing with if you have Jesus himself in the middle, but that language, I think if Douglas Murray could hit the pause and comment on this, he might say, I don't know what that means. What does it mean to have Jesus in the middle? And that's, preachers, theologians, this is what we need to work on. And maybe it maybe the words, it's seen in these moments of cruciform sacrificial service. So, but I just wanted to pause there because that's the language that Christians go to and it isn't communicating. And so Christians have to pause and say, okay, those words aren't working. Okay, Jesus, show me some new words.
But perhaps you would expect a theologian always to come
it's
back
important.
and talk about Jesus.
If I say it comes back to the point. It's the most important thing to do as a theologian, and as a Christian, and it is, as I say, it is an enormous relief to hear it.
I mean, you say it's an enormous relief there, Douglas. In a sense,
here comes Justin.
For you, obviously, you came to the point where you couldn't believe that this story was literally true, but you miss it. You even described yourself as a Christian atheist. I mean, the culture at large.
Justin has the most interesting altar calls. Let's put him on the spot. See if he still comes on the show. This isn't Douglas Murray's first appearance on the show, and he pretty much knows Justin's coming in for something.
There's probably a lot of other Douglas Murrays out there, and people perhaps for whom Christianity has never figured in their life. But if Christianity is the story that did work, and the stories that we're now telling aren't working and putting us out of joint, can you see any way in which the Christian story, even as a non-Christian, could start to make inroads again? Is it simply about the church standing up again and being a bit more confident?
I'm not sure I say it only as confidence. I've said many years that I see an enormous opportunity for people of faith to be speaking into perhaps a more receptive crowd than before. I do see that. I do think, to perhaps the rather hackneyed reference to Matthew Arnold, but I do always think that the interesting thing about the sea of faith is there's no reason why it can't come back in. The sea doesn't only withdraw. It's the point of tides, but for that to happen, what would be on offer would have to be radically different from everything else in the society that's on offer. That's one of the reasons why I've been very interested. I can't remember if we talked about this with Justin before, but I've been very interested in recent years watching contemporaries of mine who have seen through, looked at, stared at some of the same problems that I have, and have come to conclusions of their own in a religious sense. I've been very struck, for instance, by not a large number of people, a relatively small number of people, but people I think of as being very intelligent thinking people who have, for instance, converted to Catholicism. And I see, I can think of one person who is an Anglican, one person who was born and brought up a Muslim, and somebody else I know who was an atheist throughout. And I don't think this is typical by any means. I'm not trying to say that. I'm just saying that among people I know who are very thoughtful, who thought about these things, have come from a wide range of different directions. They have gone towards that, and what has struck me most is that they have gone to the most traditional form of that faith. I'm talking about people who've gone into Tridentine mass attending Catholicism. They don't go to the weaker forms of it because they want to drink as directly from the well as they can.
Yes.
And that bears so much. Okay, what about the Latin Mass? What about why does that get it directly to the source as they can? Now, again, think about this restorationist movement within Christianity. I mean, Protestantism. Okay, there's too much crud that's built up on the church. Let's go back to the New Testament church. You see this movement again and again, and so Douglas Murray is right. The tide goes out, the tide comes in.
That seems to me to be, as I say, why it saddens me, to put it no stronger, that a religion with this inheritance, with all of this to offer, would offer the most watered down version of itself, to the extent that it is a version that is indistinguishable from everything else on offer in society.
Yes, I very much understand.
Church that loses its saltiness, church that its light's under a bushel.
And that I think at the same time, there is a sense which is deeply rooted in Jesus himself going and eating with sinners, doing things that nobody was expecting a Messiah, a prophet to do, breaking the social taboos in order to be on all fours with the people who really needed him. There was the shock that went through the system with that, but that's happened again and again throughout Christian history, that Christianity is a missionary religion, and missionaries find that they do their work better when they're actually on all fours with the people that they're trying to get to know, and not, as it were, saying, here is this amazing unattainable ideal and I'm up there somewhere and maybe you could find your way up if you're lucky, because that's how it sometimes comes across to people. And so there's this tension the whole time between that wonderful, rich thing, as you say, drinking from the well itself, which, of course, for me is what I think both reading the Bible, saying my prayers, going to ordinary worship services, that's what it's all about. It's absolutely central. But there is a to and a fro. And again, it's because of a belief in the goodness of God's creation that actually these people out there are created by God. God loves them, and I am called to love them as well and to get alongside them and not, as it would appear to some, hold myself away from them by going to something so recondite that the average mortal would never even have the slightest idea what it was all about. I think that tension is always going to be there.
Well, if I may say so, just very quickly on this, I completely agree. But a very interesting thing that's happening at the moment is that the abstract not getting involved in the nitty-gritty of your era is actually what is happening mistakenly. We ran a piece just this week. I don't want to keep plugging The Spectator, but we ran a piece just in the new edition out this week.
I said Statesman before it's The Spectator, and I'm sure there were plenty of comments on that.
By very intelligent young clergyman talking about just saying, look, the latest. Again, I also don't want to spend the whole time bashing the Church of England, but he said the latest thing this week is an edict on church memorials, and there is going to be an expectation of that memorials in churches across England that are connected with, for instance, the most obvious one is slavery, will have to be reconsidered. And this clergyman just says, I was so moved by it. He said, I have 4 churches that I oversee. If I am to spend my time going through this, he said, first of all, no one has ever complained about a memorial, ever, Jimmy.
I don't know what these memorials are. Anselman or one of you Brits can, or Scots, or however you identify yourselves, can maybe enlighten me what he's talking about here.
So if I'm to spend my time doing this, I will not be able to spend my time ministering to the people in my parishes. So it is as straightforward as that. And as I say, what strikes me is that there is a drive for what is mistakenly thought to be a drive that will satisfy and impress people in the era, when in
consumerism.
fact it will take the church precisely away from its activities.
Yeah,
it seems to me an example of a massive misunderstanding of where the church's priorities ought to be in order to impress the rest.
Yeah.
But should the church try to impress Douglas Murray, or should the church try to impress these other people that are wanting the church to be impressed? And if the church thinks that its job is to impress people and in that way somehow recruit them or indoctrinate them or something, is that what the church should do?
The country.
Fascinating conversation. Time is slipping by so fast, though, and I did promise those who are watching.
Justin Brierley needs to take a page from Joe Rogan. This conversation could have gone on another hour productively, probably. So
on YouTube and Facebook, some opportunity to ask questions. We had a lot of them coming in.
So I'm going to stop it here because I need to go home, and I will pick up the questions because the questions were actually at least as good as the main conversation. And so the questions could have been longer too. So this will be part 1 and there will be a part 2. Let me know what you think in the comment section.